Thank you all for coming, invited guests, students, colleagues, faculty members, and other members of the AUB community. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to reintroduce AUB to one of its own prodigal sons, a distinguished member of the academic community whose formative years as a scholar began on this very campus. Suleiman Mourad, currently the Myra M. Sampson Professor of Religion at Smith College in Massachusetts. Professor Mourad completed his bachelor's degree in mathematics at the AUB before also completing his BA at the Department of History and Archaeology in history. So 2 BAs from AUB. Since then, he has dedicated 3 decades of his life to the study of Islamic thought, history, and culture during various periods and across multiple different disciplines. After completing his master's degree in history at the AUB, Professor Mourad moved on to Yale University, where he received his PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies in 2004. Since then, he has published extensively in such subfields as early Islam, the period of the Crusades, Islamic legal culture, and a variety of other subjects, which would be too many to list here. Some of his most recent monographs include a study of the great 12th century historian and scholar of Damascus, Ibn Asakir, an anthology of Muslim sources of the Crusader period, which he edited and translated with James Lindsay, and the critical edition and study of Walid Hamad al-Ramli's Fada'il Bayt al-Maqdis, or the Merits of Jerusalem. And since this is the Kamal Salibi Memorial Lecture, it also bears mentioning that Professor Mourad was one of the editors of the festschrift dedicated to Kamal Salibi, entitled In the House of Understanding. And that is especially appropriate because Professor Mourad has approached his scholarly work with the same level of critical care and healthy skepticism that defined Kamal Salibi's career. Before I give the floor to Professor Mourad, one final comment. I'd just like to note that today's lecture on the Caliphate is a sneak preview on a larger book project on the same subject, which he is currently developing. But without further ado, Professor Mourad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Abu Hussein, for this very kind, generous introduction. It's very sentimental for me to be standing in front of you to be delivering this year's memorial lecture in honor of our great teacher, Kamal Salibi. It's indeed very emotional for me to be back at AUB, where all my intellectual experience started, especially looking at you in the audience and seeing some great friends, great teachers who were instrumental in the formation of my academic journey. And that's something that is imprinted in my character. And I'm extremely honored, therefore, to be here. As Professor Tariq Abu Hussein said, this is a project that I'm currently working on as part of a larger monograph. And therefore, I will be only touching partly the surface. It's a very complicated topic, as you might guess. And I've already heard lots of people asking when they heard the Caliph, what Caliph? And so let me, in a way, remove some of the suspense and say what I'll be sharing with you this evening is a kind of a survey of the history of the Caliphate throughout the Islamic period, from the very beginning till today. And I'm going to start with, let me first step back and thank all those at AUB who were responsible for making this possible. The history department in particular, and all the administrative assistants, usually those people behind the scene that make these things possible. So thanks, my thanks go to the people known or unknown who made this, my flight, my accommodations, my everything, including my parents, all of that possible. I'm going to start with a little bit of a story to anchor my presentation. In June 1261, 9 months following the Mamluk defeat of the Mongol army in the Battle of Ain Jalut, a person named Abu al-Qasim Ahmad appeared in the Mamluk court in Cairo. He claimed to be the son of the Abbasid Caliph, Al-Zahir bi Amrillah, who reigned from 1225 till 1226, and uncle of the last Caliph. I'm starting my timer, sorry. The last Caliph, Al-Mu'tasim Billah, who reigned from 1242 till 1258, who was killed by the Mongols in 1258. I apologize for the many dates, they might be confusing. Anyway, Sultan Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, welcomed the visitor and saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity flash in front of his eyes. Declaring Abu al-Qasim Ahmad a caliph would make Baybars the savior of the caliphate and an outright champion in Sunnism, thus removing all the questions of his own legitimacy that has plagued his rise to power. As a background, Baybars was a slave from what is today northwest Kazakhstan, and he was brought and raised in the army of the Ayyubids, reaching the level of senior commander, but he was implicated in the assassination of the last Ayyubid caliph, Sultan Turan Shah, in 1250, and a few years after, he was also part of a group who assassinated the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and took throne in 1260. So there is plenty of need for Baybars to wash his many quote-unquote sins by looking at this opportunity of declaring a caliph at a time when the caliphate was vacant. The great historian Ibn Wasil reported about the arrival of this Abu al-Qasim Ahmad from Baghdad. Ibn Wasil must have suspected some kind of a ruse, some kind of a ploy. It didn't sit well with him, because he points to us two things that are extremely panegyric in the way, and pejorative in a way that he used them. He first says that this Abu al-Qasim Ahmad is black. So in a way, it raised some doubts. He suspects that he is from a descendant from the last Abbasid caliphs. And two, he said those who came with him were Bedouin Arabs to avow that he is a true person. And in the time of Ibn Wasil, to say Bedouin Arabs would have meant people who essentially you pay them money and they can tell whatever you want. So he forefronting this story in kind of suspicion, but he goes on to further relate that Baybars convened all the dignitaries of Cairo, administrators, officers, jurists, justices, and the assembled court interrogated Abu al-Qasim Ahmad and were assured by his answers that he was not an impostor. Everyone took turns to declare allegiance, bay'ah, to the new caliph, who chose the title of Al-Mustansir Billah, that is, the one empowered by God. The caliphate was saved thanks to Baybars, and Al-Mustansir's first act was to confer on Baybars the title of Sultan. Very symbolic, but very meaningful. A public declaration ensued. News was sent throughout the Mamluk realm. A letter arrived in Damascus on 19 June 1261, and it was read aloud in the Adiliya College to the cheers of many locals. Sunnism had its caliph again. Al-Mustansir was determined to return to Iraq with an army to liberate Baghdad from the Mongols. Sultan Baybars happily obliged and equipped the new caliph with soldiers and cash. Al-Mustansir departed with a large retinue of scholars from Egypt and Syria, many of whom had their eyes on the now vacant prestigious positions in the Abbasid administration, and also the many well-endowed professorships in Baghdad. But before reaching Baghdad, they were ambushed by a Mongol brigade and massacred. The tragic end of this short episode, notwithstanding, it revealed the level of anxiety many Sunni Muslims in particular must have felt when the Mongols sacked Baghdad and killed Al-Mustasim in 1258. Despite the fact that the Abbasid caliphs were since the 10th century largely ineffectual and only exercised symbolic authority in the world of Sunnism, their presence extended a semblance of normalcy for Sunnis. The death of al-Mustasim, therefore, in 1258, abruptly interrupted this normalcy and caused some panic, which we hear in the repeated refrain by many Muslim chronicles of the period: Islam has never seen a worse or more terrible calamity than this one, meaning the killing of al-Mustasim. Thus, the appearance of a claimant in the Mamluk court awakened the desire to reinstate a caliph who would assure the continuity of the institution, for many thought the world would not be normal without it. That's the rhetoric. World order was surely on the mind of some Muslims when Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols. Even though the circumstances of the killing of al-Mustasim are not known, several legends circulated about it. One such legend reveals how some Muslims equated the presence of the caliph with the endurance of the world. For instance, the 12er Shi'i historian Ibn al-Tiqtaqa related in his book Al-Fakhri fil Adab al-Sultaniya the following about al-Mustasim's killing. And you have the text in English and Arabic, you can follow that. When Hulagu captured Baghdad and wanted to kill Caliph Abu Ahmad, Abdullah al-Mustasim, someone told him that if the caliph is killed, the entire universe will lose its balance, the sun will not rise, the rain will not fall, and the plants will not grow. Hulagu hesitated and then asked a scholar about the matter. The scholar was very honest in his reply. Ali ibn Abi Talib was much better than this caliph by the admission of everyone in the world. He was killed and these things did not occur. Likewise, Al-Hussein and even the ancestor of this caliph, they were horribly killed and neither the sun failed to rise nor the rain stopped. When Hulagu heard that, his hesitation was gone and obviously he ordered the killing of al-Mustasim. What this legend tells us is that Hulagu was reluctant to execute al-Mustasim until he was assured by a Muslim scholar in his court that nothing will happen to the world if the caliph was killed. In my presentation today, I argue that the development of the institution of the caliphate and the religious thought about it and its function and role were motivated by peculiar historical dynamics. During the Umayyad, early Abbasid and Fatimid periods, those dynamics led to the promotion of the caliph as God's deputy, Khalifatullah in Arabic, in order to claim absolute religious and political authority, irrespective of whether or not that was achievable. So here I'm talking to some extent about the desire. Different historical dynamics led to the gradual marginalization of the institution of the caliphate, resulting in the reassignment of religious authority to scholars and political authority to sultans and vizier. However symbolic and ceremonial the actual caliphs became, and in some cases non-existent, I mean the authority, some scholars kept talking about the crucial role of the institution in theoretical or theological terms, even though in their own respective times, they did not see a place for it. And here, essentially, my argument is that we shouldn't simply look literally at what Muslim religious scholars say about the caliphate. We need to ask, what do they mean by what they say? And do they really mean literally something applicable to their own time? Or is this nostalgic, theological, historical, futuristic, and things of that type? The Umayyads. The term caliph indicates the title of the ruler of the Muslim polity. And it also, when we talk about caliph, it also evokes the institution itself. So Khalifa and Khilafa. Even though later Muslim literary sources apply it retroactively to the first 4 rulers after the Prophet Muhammad, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, there is no contemporary proof that this is actually the case. Datable evidence suggests that the title was first claimed by the Umayyads, who ruled, for your reference, from 661 till 750. And they meant by it deputy of God, Khalifatullah. When Muslim scholars later on applied it to the period of what is known as the rightly guided caliphs, Al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, they were mainly contesting the Umayyads' claim. and alleging that the first rulers used the title to mean successor of the Messenger of God, Khalifat Rasulullah. So in very brief terms, the title started as Khalifat Allah, and then later on it gave rise to Khalifat Rasulullah. The Quran mentions the term Khalifa several times. Except in one case, they all mean either the human creation or groups who replaced other groups. However, in verse 38-26, you have in front of you there, where the Quran declares, "O David, we appointed you a deputy on earth, so judge between people in truth." The term clearly indicates governance and adjudication of human affairs. It does not seem that the Muslim rulers, however, adopted this title of caliph until the Umayyads. Indeed, as said earlier, evidence points solidly to the use of the term during the Umayyad period, such as the standing caliph dirham minted in 694-695 during the reign of Abd al-Malik. This is essentially when the evidence started to come to light, the period of Abd al-Malik. Abd al-Malik bin Marwan, and he reigned from 685 till 705. For you. All of the dates I'm giving are for the common era, commonly here referred to the after Christ. And this one in particular, if you look at the right side, it features on the left side of or the right side of the standing figure, Amir al-Mu'mineen, and on the right side, left side, sorry. So the right side of the standing figure, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the left side is, you could read it, Khallafahullah. Some read it Khalifat Allah, and they assume that there is a mistake in the mating, that the ya is dropped. But at any case, this is the first time actually we have a datable piece of evidence that tells us that this word Khalifat Allah is used. Right? And on the next to that face, this is a dirham, as you probably know. The Muslims used the same kind of base that the Persians were using. So usually the head is for one of the last Persian Sassanid rulers. And interestingly, this is for something else, but it also shows us that the Muslims adopted something central from the Sassanids, and that is the crescent and the star in the middle, and that became the symbol of Islam. So this is one of the things of what you call influences that ultimately were taken by the Muslims and adopted. But next to the face, we have the exact dating. ضرب هذا الدرهم في سنة 75 للهجرة. And this is the first time ever we have such a thing. Yet, it is in Umayyad poetry where we see the widespread use of the expression Khalifat Allah. The famous Umayyad court poets, and I have here 3 examples. Al-Akhtal, for instance, who died in 710, expressed to Abd al-Malik, "I sacrifice my soul for the commander of the faithful. When he reveals his teeth on the arduous day of battle, he is confident. He rushes into battle with fortune on his end. Caliph of Khad, Khalifat Allah, whose intervention we seek when rail fails to descend." And similarly, Al-Farazdaq said something similar to Suleiman bin Abd al-Malik. And we have also after that Jarir, Jarir saying to Umar bin Abdul Aziz. So all of a sudden, you have that coin, and directly coincidental with the coin, and after we have all of this Umayyad poetry where the concept of Khalifat Allah comes up. So the significance of this poetry, aside from the fact that we attest to the first occurrence of the use of the term, is in the fact that it is propagating the idea that God chose the caliph, or the caliph is God's deputy. The Umayyad caliphs themselves were the direct beneficiaries of this propaganda, as it is substantiated their claim to absolute and uncontested authority over political and religious realms. There were regular confrontations, this is as a background, with many opponents, the revolt of Imam al-Hussein and his assassination in 680 is a case in point. There is also the revolt of Ibn Zubayr. Obviously, here I'm taking the angle of the Umayyads. I'm not intentionally doing that, but from the Umayyads' point of view, they are actually contesting power with several of their opponents. You have the Shia, proto-Shiites, you have Ibn Zubayr as well. So they were searching for legitimacy, and they sought that legitimacy in the title of Khalifatullah. Incidentally, it seems Ibn Zubayr could have used a similar title, Khalifat al-Rahman. And that tells us about this debate being actually more in the public eye rather than behind closed doors. Therefore, given the role of poetry as a very impactful media outlet, these lines and many like them help disseminate the notion of the Umayyad Caliph as one acting out a divine role and therefore cementing that concept among the Muslims at the time. One might even argue that the opposite view, and here I go back to a point I raised earlier, that the Caliph, in the sense of Khalifat Rasulullah, was articulated as a rejection of the widespread use of the title Khalifatullah by the Umayyads and their propagandists therefore to challenge that. A turning point in the history of the institution of the Caliphate was the reign of Al-Ma'mun, and here 813, 833 for those who need the period. In particular, it is when Al-Ma'mun imposed the Mihna, the theological inquisition around the issue of the createdness of the Quran. It was the most principal issue. There were other issues as well. One of Al-Ma'mun's objective was to re-establish his absolute authority as caliph, especially in religious affairs, which was being contested by an emerging class of religious scholars. We can have a good idea of Al-Ma'mun's own understanding of caliphal authority in a letter he wrote in early spring of 833 to his governor in Baghdad, Ishaq ibn Ibrahim, who was also the head of the police there. And Al-Ma'mun says, "It is a duty owed to God that the Imam, Caliph of the Muslims, exert their efforts to uphold God's religion that he entrusted to them." You know, the Caliphs are the trustee of religion. They transmit the prophetic teachings. That is, they are the main instrument to make sure that the Hadith, which has become one of the cornerstone of Islamic religious sciences, they are the trustee for that. And spread knowledge that he deposited in them. For the commander of the faithful is aware that the overwhelming majority of Muslims, the riffraff and the scum, are ignorant of God, cannot find him, and are astray from truth of his religion. So that gives us really a good idea about how he sees himself as executing the function of the caliphate. Thus, Al-Ma'mun believed that God entrusted him as a caliph with the duty of trustee of religion, again, heir of the Prophet, propagator of knowledge. His Mihna inquisition alienated mainly Hadith scholars, what we call them traditionalist Sunnis, who were some of its first victims and who came to play a major role in the development of traditionalist Sunnism. This was a watershed moment in Islamic history in that the caliph's absolute religious authority in Sunni Islam was shattered beyond repair. It can be said, therefore, that what Al-Ma'mun unintentionally accomplished was cementing the belief among religious scholars, Sunnis in particular, that Islam must be under their authority as a collective class, which became gradually the uncontested reality in Sunnism by the end of the 9th century. So what the Mihna established that process, and by the end of that century, caliphs lost complete religious authority. The 10th century saw the other side of the erosion of caliphal political authority. And I mean namely when the Shi'i Buyids took control of Baghdad, 945 till 1055. Since then, the most that can be said about the Abbasid caliphs is that they were largely symbolic figures. Their function was ceremonial, to bestow legitimacy on actual rulers who pledged nominal allegiance to them, whether they were Buyids, Seljuks, Ayyubids, Mamluks, etc. And the other Sunni caliphate at the time, the Umayyads of Spain, also ended in 1031. and had largely marginal impact, if any, on the history of the caliphate as an institution in a pan-Islamic context. So yeah, we can talk about the Umayyads of Spain, but they are extremely irrelevant to looking at the institution in a pan-Islamic context. So the weaknesses of the institution notwithstanding, Sunni religious scholars revisited, theoretically at least, the importance of the caliphate as an institution and its divine role in the leadership of religion and state. The words of Al-Mawardi, who died in 1058, sum up this tendency, despite the fact that the actual caliphs at this time were mere puppets. In his influential book, Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, Al-Mawardi argued that the Almighty God has delegated for this community a leader, Imam, who is the successor, Khalaf of the prophecy, and made him the guardian of religion. He delegated to him governance so that its management is based on legitimate religion and there be unity and obedience to his world. Thus, the imamate was made as a foundation upon which the laws of the community are based and the affairs of the Muslim community are studied. Very similar to what Al-Ma'mun had said. But actually, Al-Mawardi meant nothing of that. Because the main objective of Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, and you can guess from the title, is that Al-Mawardi wanted to give the religious and historical foundations for the caliph delegating his power to sultans and viziers. And therefore, the main focus, aside from this exercise in theory of Al-Mawardi, is to tell us exactly how all the authority of the caliph transfers. So he uses two important concepts, tafweed, delegation, and istinaba. In other words, Al-Mawardi sanctioned the reality that existed at his time, namely that actual political power was now in the hands of sultans and viziers, not in the hands of caliphs, which in his opinion was illegitimate in Islam. Therefore, his words here essentially are meant for idealization. No more, no less. Indeed, faced with new reality, Sunni scholars gave up on the institution of the caliphate as a base of real political power and legitimacy and reassigned them to those who actually held power, provided they championed Sunnism and its religious tenets. This is clearly stated by Al-Juwayni in his influential book, Ghiyath al-Umam fi Iltiyas al-Zulam. It translates as rescuing the lands from the overwhelming darkness, where he essentially endorsed the Seljuk Caesar of political power. If a powerful man enjoying massive followers and widespread support were to rise, upholding the law, commanding right, all of this language is about maintaining the main tenets of Sunnism and prohibiting wrong and taking responsibility on behalf of the Muslims for what they entrusted to him, then that man should proceed forward. For God will support him on the condition that he pursues the benefits and what leads to success. In these words, very Locke, Hobbes, whatever, you can make modern connotations with modern European philosophy, but this is not my point here. In these words, Al-Juwayni gave total legitimacy to the Seljuk sultans and their viziers to become the de facto guardians of Islam and not even require any type of deputation or delegation from a sitting caliph. In every respect, it was the views of influential scholars like Al-Mawardi, Al-Juwayni, even Al-Ghazali mentioned something to this effect, that cemented among Sunnis the final shift that political authority has to rest with the institution of the Sultanate, which became the hallmark of rule in Sunnism from the late 11th century up till the 20th century, and in some places it remains till this day. Moreover, these influential Sunni scholars equally believed that it was no more tenable to restore the authority over religious matters back to the caliph, now that they, as a class, became well established as the true guardians of Islam and Islamic religious science. These dynamics also dominated to some extent discussions about the caliphate during the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. If we look at As-Suyuti, for instance, he's known for writing Tarikh al-Khulafa, very interesting book. But against the entire logic of this book, which chronicles all the caliphs that came into Islamic history, in his introduction, As-Suyuti essentially tells us that, by quoting two hadiths, that the Prophet said there were, the period of the caliphate only extends over 30 years after his death, which blows up the entire legitimacy of all caliphs after 30 years. But he also relates another hadith, which is equally perplexing, that the Prophet said there will be 12 caliphs. And he went on essentially to name them. And he, as you see there, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, Al-Hasan bin Ali, Muawiyah ibn Zubair, Umar bin Abdul Aziz, Al-Muhtadi Billah, Abbasid, and Al-Zahir Billah, another Abbasid. They reigned, these two Abbasids, for a few months, up to a year maximum. So it's interesting that he only picked the Abbasid that ruled the least. And then he says that two remain to come in the future. And therefore, what is the purpose of the current Abbasid caliphs in Cairo, who were absolutely useless, right? And here you realize from the words of As-Suyuti that what he meant is that these are only needed so that the progeny is sustained, so that at the end of times, the last caliph, who is from the house of the Prophet Muhammad, al-Mahdi, will come. This is not a Shi'ism. This is classic Sunnism that believes about the end of time caliphate. So this is extremely interesting, but this would never have been expressed in a context where the caliphs would have any kind of power. This is something out of a period where the caliphate lost complete relevance, and therefore the scholars started to think, okay, we have caliphs, what is their role? They reduced it to that role. Incidentally, by the way, it's stunning that this is also expressed by Fatimi Shi'is in Egypt in the 10th century, that one of the functions of the Fatimid caliph is to sustain this line so that the caliphs can propagate in some ways. And actually it explains, if you know about about Ayyubid history, when Saladin refused to allow the Fatimids to elect another caliph, that the Ismailis in Egypt were keen to keep the line going, even though they were in prisons. The Ottoman invasion of Egypt in 1516, 1517, witnessed the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Ottomans ended that. And it introduced, ironically, new dynamic into the shift that I discussed above. As if what happens is, in the quotes that you have from Lutfi Basha, is that Lutfi Basha brought what Al-Mawardi and Al-Juwayni and Ghazali, they argued, to its ultimate conclusion. What Lutfi Basha essentially is writing, Lutfi Basha was Sadr al-Azam, was a Grand Vizier of Sultan Suleiman, the lawgiver. In English, he's called Suleiman the Magnificent. So he was Sadr al-Azam from 1539 till 1541, and he wrote his book, خلاص الأمة في معرفة الأئمة, essentially to argue that Sultan Suleiman merits being the caliph, right? And here it's not the caliph delegating its power to the Sultan. It's not the Sultan not needing delegation, and because they are powerful enough. Here is because he is the Sultan, as you see in the quote above, he merits being the caliph. And I'm going to save you. You can read it on your own leisure. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to. So, as I said, Lutfi Basha brought the central point of Al-Mawardi Jumayni to its ultimate conclusion. It's not only that political rule transfers to Sultan, given the weakness of the caliph, the Sultan becomes the caliph. Nevertheless, the pleas of Lutfi Basha did not succeed or leave a lasting impact, and I argue precisely because the historical momentum was already not in favor of reinstating the caliphate. You know, people were happy with the Sultan. You want to call yourself caliph, call yourself caliph, right? We are fine with whatever you want, but the institution itself doesn't interest anyone, except in some kind of a symbolic, and not to mention, by the way, that Lutfi Basha, one of his main challenge was to prove that Suleiman is, and the Sultans usually must be from Quraysh. So actually he has a whole section in his book trying to argue that actually, no, that's not the case. Muslims never agreed on that. Anyway, It's very pertinent here that I've actually focused so much on Sunni نيابة عامة was believed to extend to the realm of politics. And that has to do with a peculiar reality in Iran as well. So what did people like Ibn Babawayh mean by talking about the caliph in the way he did, and many others? It could have been partly a theoretical speculation and nostalgic aspiration, given the reality around them. But we should not dismiss the possibility that it was also theologically necessary, given the 12 Shia belief in the absolute right of their imams to have occupied the post of caliph and guard the right of the hidden imam to it once he reappears. Now I'm moving to my last part about modernity. Modernity introduced new challenges in the Muslim world. The race to reform and progress became the obsession of most Muslims, especially religious and secular reformers, and affected their thinking about the caliphate. Some argued that the institution is essential in order to oversee the reforms and guarantee their compliance with Islamic law and dogma. Others saw it as irrelevant and even un-Islamic, in the sense that true Islam calls for the separation of religious matters from state matters. Essentially, the core of my argument here that modernity determined the contour of this conversation. This is not an organic continuation of medieval discussion about the caliphate. This is a completely new discussion of the caliphate that could have appealed to medieval sources, but is completely framed by modernity and this question, how to reform and who can lead us in these kind of reforms. The Indian Muslim reformer, Chirag Ali, as you see there, who died in 1895, he was, probably many of you never heard of him. He was a close friend, colleague of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who was much more famous than him, alleged in his book on reform, the proposed political, legal, and social reforms in the Ottoman Empire and other Mohammedan states. He argued that reforms are necessary. Ironically, he argued that Islam doesn't teach us anything about the reforms. We have to figure them out. But his only problem was who can figure out those reforms that are need to be done on legal matters, civil law matters, pretty much on so many things. And his reply was that, as you see there, I reply at once, His Imperial Majesty the Sultan. You know, Chirag Ali is Muslim Indian. He's living under British rule. The Sultan is competent enough to bring about any political, legal, or social reforms on the authority of the Quran. That is, the Quran delegates this authority to him. Not that he will follow the Quran, because essentially the book of Ali is to say that the Quran does not give us actually the information to do that. He's the only legal authority on matters of innovation, being a successor to the successors of the Prophet. And here, he wrote this book in English, so I'm taking exactly verbatim. I'm translating that part below. So he calls the Sultan Khalifat Khulafa Rasulullah, Khalifa Khalifai Rasulullah, and Amir al-Mu'mineen, the Sawt al-Hayy, or the living voice of Islam. Thus, according to Ali, it was the Ottoman Sultan who has the exclusive mandate and capacity to give the desired political, legal, and social reforms the legitimacy they need. The question, and here, by the way, Ali was very instrumental in the formation of the Khilafah movement in India, which lasted from 1919 till 1924, when the Turkish Republic essentially abolished the caliphate. So Ali's views that many in India shared at the time originated in the peculiar dilemma and fear of the Indian Muslims, who were wedged between a Hindu majority on the one hand and the suppressive British imperial rule on the other hand. Promoting a pan-Islamic caliphate gave them a sense of belonging to a conceived Muslim universe beyond India, irrespective of whether or not it was a realistic aspiration. I don't think they were realistically looking for a political union in as much as symbolic union. It's to be noted that the Ottoman sultans themselves toyed with the title of caliph definitely throughout the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. A case in point during the Crimean War, 1853, 1856, during the First World War as well, 1914, 1918. There were as well other groups who self-proclaimed their leaders as caliphs, such as the movement of Osman Dan Fodio in today northwestern Nigeria, which spread to Western Africa. It's often called as the Sokoto Caliphate. He died in 1117. There was as well the claim of the ruler of the famous Sharif Hussein bin Ali, who died in 1931 when the Turks abolished the caliphate. He right away tried to declare himself caliph, but it was unsuccessful. What all of this tells us is that there was energy about the caliphate, but it wasn't resonating with anybody. The defining moment in the debate and about the caliphate and its function actually unfolded in this period, early 1920s, in India, in the Arab world, in Egypt, in Turkey. And it all around before and after the abolition of the caliphate by, obviously, commandership of the believers are three expressions that mean the same thing, namely the leadership of Islamic governance. And he goes on and on about how it is a binding duty and how Muslims essentially err if they don't appoint a caliph. In the second one, he also goes on to define to us precisely what he meant by the caliphate. To sum this, what you have in front of you again for the saving of time, Rida alleges that the caliph is not only the symbol of unity, his office combines all the essential functions of effective governance, legislative, executive, and judicial. And as supreme leader, he is the head of a representative council, which comprises the men of power and influence, Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd. He also advocated that electing a caliph is not only a rational binding duty, but a legal binding duty. And the Muslims therefore fail to fulfill their religious duties if there is no properly elected caliph to whom they must avow allegiance. The irony that you ask is that, let me first finish another idea. The abolition of the caliphate in 1924 gave Rida another opportunity to reassert his views. This time, he held a huge conference in Cairo at the Azhar between 13 and 23 May 1926. And essentially, the biggest question in front of the conveners and the attendees was how to put together a group of elites who can go on to elect the caliph. And Rida admitted in one of the pieces in Al-Manar that many religious scholars, were against reinstating the caliphate. One of those was Ali Abd al-Raziq, who published in 1925 his infamous book, Al-Islam wa Usul al-Hukm. Abd al-Raziq argued, and here is very interestingly, that there was not a single verse in the Quran that supports the claim that the installation of a caliph is a religious duty, the exact opposite of what Rida was arguing. Worse than that, he mentioned that the caliphate at all, and he mentioned that the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet do not mention the caliphate at all, and there was never a consensus among the Muslims about it and its function. Again, I think there is another one, if I'm not mistaken, that also give us some ideas about. Thus, in Abd al-Raziq's view, the caliphate, both in its religious and political aspect, is alien to the teachings of Islam, and the issue of governance is completely left to the Muslims to determine based on rationalism, experience, political philosophy, and what is to their best interest at any given time. The fact that the push for reinstatement of the caliphate was essentially dropped even by its staunchest advocates. And it's interesting when, for instance, Rida tells us that it's a binding duty and the Muslims err if they don't appoint a caliph, and then he gets stuck with the problem of how do you elect the caliph, and then you have to go and pick the Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd. Then you realize that actually this is a very long process. It's not overnight. And you go back to ask Rida, okay, how long this is going to take before you can? So even the staunchest advocates of the caliphate ultimately dropped it because the historical momentum was absolutely not in its favor. And the majority of the Muslims would only think of it as part of a vestige of a glorious past. It does not belong in their future political plans. Nevertheless, the debate about it kept happening. And I think we have to contextualize also the modernist debate about the caliphate as affected and impacted and conditioned by four major dynamics that happened. There is debates over nationalism, state nationalism. Here I mean Syrian, Egyptian, Turkish, ethnic nationalism, Arab, pan-Arab, pan-Turkic, pan-Persian, or pan-Islamism. There is another trajectory about golden age, reform by bringing the Muslims back to the golden age. What golden age? There is also the debate about modernization by bringing European reforms and ideas, but Islamizing them, right? And there is also the debate about the complete separation of church and state. All of these debates impacted this conversation about the caliphate. And even in 12er Shia circles, around the same time that Rida and Abdul Razik talked about their views of the caliphate, we have Ayatollah Muhammad Hassan Qazwini, who equally argued that the grand imamate and supreme caliphate is a universal divine task, wilaya ilahiyya amma, and that belief in the great imamate and glorious caliphate is an integral component of prophethood and its essential mission, and is therefore a foundational principle of religion. Yet, he does not address at all how 12er Shias in his day should go about actualizing the institution. So really, when we read those literature, the last we need to do is to take them for what they say, and actually not only read between the lines, but read their context, the historical moment that necessitated their production for peculiar kinds of historical propaganda or historical argumentation that are divorced from the actuality of the day. Furthermore, modern 12er Shia theologians and jurists generally drop the use of the Khalifa, and the term is completely missing from the vocabulary, say, of modern 12er Shiism, especially in Iran, when the institution of the wilayati faqih, the faqih does not actualize the caliphate, right? There is completely no conversation about the faqih being a caliph. This doesn't exist at all in the world of Shiism today. So my argument in this presentation as a conclusion is that the Muslims thinking about the caliphate and the caliph was never similar, even though they might have used the same vocabulary. The motivations were tied to historical circumstances that produced social, political, and religious realizations and needs. With the Umayyads and early Abbasids and Fatimids, these expectations and needs necessitated the promotion of the caliph as God's deputy in order to allow the caliphs, quote unquote, to claim absolute religious and political authority. Different circumstances altered those realizations and needs and led to the Muslims gradually accepting the marginalizations of the actual institution of the caliphate, as we saw with al-Mawardi and even in 12er Shiism, or supporting the transfer of its role to the sultans, as we saw expressed by people like Juwayni and Lutfi Pasha. The attempts of al-Ma'mun to assert his absolute authority only weakened the caliphate politically and religiously beyond repair. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, modernity awakened all types of desires about the nature and course of the reforms that the Muslims envisioned or wished to enact. Some religious and political reformers, as we saw with Chirag Ali and Muhammad Rashid Rida, advocated that reform is only possible and achievable if the caliph takes charge of the process. But the advocacy of the revival of the caliphate was met with staunch resistance, as we saw with Ali Abdul Razik and the popularity of his views among many Arab Muslim elites. Often we think of Abdul Razik as controversial. Actually, Abdul Razik was expressing the views on the street. Like, this is what people wanted at the time. But he wasn't yet in control of the institutions. And often we have a bias as scholar to draft to the people that make most noise, actually, than the people who make the most representation. So what we see at the time is that all those who try to articulate arguments for the caliphate collapsed. And the only groups that ultimately succeeded were the argument of Abdul Razik, the Kemalist in Turkey was the abolition of the caliphate. In India, the Khilafah movement collapsed. That nowadays, only the most vicious forms of Islamic militancy, such as Daesh and the Islamic State, or even clandestine groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, advocate for the actual reinstatement of the caliphate, only demonstrates how alienated the Muslims generally are from making the institution of the caliphate an essential component of their political and religious reality. This does not mean that all those who rejected it are actually against it as an idea. As we saw in several cases in this presentation, the dichotomy between the actual and the ideal sums up for us the way Muslims have promoted or ignored the caliph and the institution of the caliphate throughout Islamic history, not as a binary, but as a very complicated dialectic, blending reality and desire, actual and symbolic, necessity and nostalgia, caliph and sultan, God and pariah. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I took a little longer time.
Thank you, Professor Mourad, for a fantastic lecture. We have 15 minutes for Q&A, if anyone has questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suleiman. I have two questions. One of them is, when did the distinction appear in the early period, meaning the early Umayyad period, between Amir al-Mu'mineen and the Khalif? Because if I remember correctly, but my memory always fails me, if I remember also the Asqar, when he talks about Malik ibn Marwan, he doesn't say, وَلَقَدْ نُصِرْتَ خَلِيفَةُ اللَّهِ, no. وَلَقَدْ نُصِرْتَ أَمِيرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ بِنَا لَمَّا أَتَاكَ بِبَطْنِ الْغُوطَةِ الْخَبَرِ. So he was addressing Abd al-Malik. And Abd al-Malik now is not the first, it's the third most important Umayyad, and still being addressed as Amir al-Mu'mineen, like Umar al-Khattab, like the Rashidun. So the term Khalifa has not apparently crept in, even in the Umayyad literature, especially in the poetry. Second, the term Khalifa also seems to have disappeared from political vision by the middle of the 9th century, right after Al-Ma'mun. When we remember also during the period of Al-Musta'in, when we have the famous poetry that says, خليفة في قفص بين وصيف وبغى يقول ما قال له كما تقول الببغاء. In other words, he became totally irrelevant just about in 850 or so. We are still at the period before the Shiites, before the Shiite century and all of that stuff. So this term, Khalifa, with all of the significance we're trying to imply into it, that it is whether Khalifatullah or Khalifat al-Rasul, all of those issues, was always contested. From the very, very beginning, it was contested. So, to my mind, it is useless for somebody like Ataturk in 1934 to say the Khilafah is abolished. Thank you very much. It was abolished already years before. Yeah. It was abolished even during the Umayyad times by Abd al-Malik. Now, all of this reconstructing a theoretical reinvigoration or a reconsideration for the term, to me, is just like playing semantics. I don't think it could carry any weight anywhere in any street, so no wonder why in the modern period it sounded like empty quotes.
Indeed.
Take one more question.
Yeah.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you so much for a great lecture and a lot of great information. My question is, knowing that the term caliphate was used starting with the Umayyads, does it still make sense for us to refer to the Rashidun Caliphate as such? Is there a better word to describe that leadership model if they weren't describing themselves as such? And do we have any reference points for what we might call them that? Thank you.
In a way, start with the second, with your question first, because it ties to Dr. Saliba's question about Amir al-Mu'mineen in particular. The attestation to Amir al-Mu'mineen is pretty early on. There are papyri, I think even from as early the time of Umar, where Ibn al-Khattab that reference him as Amir al-Mu'mineen, and we have plenty of references to that title. So this is the first title that Muslims adopted. Therefore, the introduction, the actual introduction of term Khalifatullah, we are confident it is Abdul Malik. Abdul Malik, as we know from so many other things, has a huge role in major political and religious transformation that happened in Islam in particular, right? One thing is that the Shahada as we know it, La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, the first time we encounter it is during Abdul Malik. There is nothing before that. There is plenty of things that we only come across. The imposition of one text of the Quran against other variants from time of Abdul Malik. Introduction of al-harakat wal-huruf in the Quran is from Abdul Malik. So the Arabization of the administration, what we call also, so this Arabization, Islamization is from the time of Abdul Malik. And all of this is partly to be read in the context that Abdul Malik is living in a very controversial period. You know, he is a controversial figure fighting rebellion, from his perspective, rebellion, so he wants to reassert his authority. And this is when we see the first encounter of Khalifatullah coined. How much? Definitely there is contestation. I agree with you completely, George, that there is contestation. And that one of the contestation is for others to say, no, Khalifa is not Khalifatullah, it's Khalifat Rasulullah. So in a way to somehow secularize it, right? They kept the title Amir al-Mu'mineen, so I don't think the appeal to a ruler as Amir al-Mu'mineen necessarily would mean that I want to challenge your title as Khalifa, right? But then when you get to a time after definitely al-Ma'mun, there you start open ridiculing of caliphs, because now you have two things. Is first, the caliphs are simply inheriting the throne on the basis of genealogy, not any merits. Right? Two, that as a scholar, you want to contest their legitimacy over religious matters. So you want to undermine that. And this is, I would agree with you that. So to make sure that I am not misunderstood, I don't want to give a chronological reading of the caliphate as something important that lost interest. I want to give emphasis that the discussion about the caliphate has to be taken as, you approach it piece by piece according to the conditions of the time. And what the Abdul Malik and the Umayyads needed, they invented something for it. Right? It was obviously challenged. Al-Ma'mun has a different kind of challenge to deal with. So he appealed to that. So everybody appealed to something and is met with, the Shiites talk about it, but it seems to be an absolute theory. Right? It is divorced from reality. So if we take it as some kind of an absolute term that has its power and it's simply do a chronological reading, we are completely missing those fine points where actually it is argumentative, it's more an institution that is being appealed to for legitimacy or not legitimacy. It's something that it's, today the debate, in the 19th, 20th century debate about the caliphate is precisely a debate about modernity. And if you are for modernity, then the caliphate is not part of your. No, I know that modernity comes with colonial, right? But
thank you very much. My question is: how does the caliphate relate to the modern present day Islamic countries and Islamic institutions. You mentioned Daesh, you mentioned other, but the powerful Islamic countries who probably would have would be shareholders in the caliphate. How do you think do they look at that? We don't hear it at all in the media or so. So what do you think? Is there a caliphate anymore?
You know, that's part of my part of my argument. Overwhelmingly, the Muslims are completely uninterested. You talk about the caliphate, we are not interested. We have other worries. Largely, overwhelming number of Muslims even are not interested in, there is talk about Sharia, but what Muslim country actually applies Sharia?
Yeah,
Name
still,
one.
But still, they claim Islamic teaching.
Absolutely. You read the Constitution of Pakistan and starts with the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Glory Quran. What does it mean? Everything you have in the Constitution is against the Sharia and the Quran, largely speaking, right? So it's empty rhetoric, and we need to acknowledge the fact that modernity brought forces that divorce the Muslims from that reality. We use the same vocabulary, but we mean completely different thing by it. So often, if, for instance, in modernity, when Muslims talk about the Quran, largely they are talking about the spirit of the Quran, which not is what is written in the text, is some other thing that they want. Freedom, democracy. You have obviously some much more conservative people that might, but even in conservative context, we only appeal to partial. Again, one country where you have an entire spectrum of Sharia court system, it doesn't exist. It's only about what? Religious law, marriage, and inheritance. So, the fact that it only exists in some quarters that are extremely militant is a proof that the rest are not interested. So yeah, the concept and the question can be evoked for sentimental reasons, for nostalgic reasons, talking about the past. So there is grandiose talk about that kind of past, but in your actual reality today, it's absolutely irrelevant.
One or two more.
Thank you very much. It's really just a question of curiosity. I noted in your presentation, in the beginning when you were giving some poetic reference from Jarir, there was a mention of Khilafah. And then, at least in the presentation, it only pops up again in the 19th century. So was it mostly about the Khalifa, or was there also a discussion of a kind of a system beyond the person, which is the Khilafah? Does that come up as well? Is it mostly on the question of the Khalifa as person?
Obviously,
as meaning,
yeah.
Rather than a system in itself?
Yeah, obviously we are at the mercy of the available sources. As far as I know, we don't have a systematic, say, in the Umayyad period, systematic discussion of the caliphate as an institution. It's a caliphate, it's khilafah, but what does it really mean? What does it entail, etc.? This is only in post-Ma'mun when you start having scholars actually digging down into what are the requirements for this position. And Mawardi is one of the best books that actually illustrate to us who can fulfill the demands of that, and ironically, the Mawardi is listing all of this in order not to say it publicly that the caliphs of his time do not fulfill that, right? So he's just telling us all of this is to make a point. So it's like anything, you invent the institution and the concept without yet realizing that you have to invent the principle behind it. And then that comes later on, like so many other things that we have. The Islamic tradition is not unique. There is plenty of.
Thank you on this, for this interesting lecture and good luck on your project. But I was wondering about the term pariah. Isn't it a bit extremist in this context?
Sorry, the term?
The term pariah. The term pariah, God and or pariah.
Pariah, yeah.
Isn't it extreme?
Yeah, it is extreme. Yeah.
What does it mean in Arabic?
Manbooz, yeah. Manbooz, yeah.
But was he manbooz?
No,
If, you know, the caliphs in Cairo, to some extent, they were Manbuzin. Yeah.
he didn't have any influence or
Yeah.
anything, but he wasn't Manbur really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, this is here we have to this. You know, in our culture in particular, and I'm not saying it in any pejorative ways, right? You might honor someone under the public realization that they need to know their limits. So Khulafa al-Abbasiyin in Cairo were Manbuzin, but in a glorious palace. Right? They can't go out of it. They can't say anything, right? So that kind of you know, very much like we say, someone is promoted in order to be sidelined, with all due respect, yeah, kicked up, yeah. So,
The British colonial system tried to reinstate some kind of.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think we don't realize how much colonial manipulation. You know, my great teacher, Professor Sai Ali, could talk about that. But there are serious suspicions about Rashid Rida being an instrument. How much he was an instrument of the British, how much he was playing them, but he was opening a channel, and how much of his talk about the caliphate was signaled. So yeah, they tried to sabotage the entire pan-Arabism, secularism, the drive for democracy, whether in Egypt or elsewhere, to instigate the Islamists like Rida to play on these tunes of caliphate and whatnot. You know, even to some extent, you could talk about India similarly. So, but this is not my field, honestly, and therefore I cannot talk in depth about it. But you cannot take it out of that conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mourad. Thank you all for coming. Let's give a big round of applause for